this kind introduction, and thank you for the organizing work of this conference. My paper will be a little bit too methodological one. It will be not about listening to early recordings, but about how to describe early recordings and how to reference to early recordings, and what the challenges of discography in the 21st century are in connection to early recordings. For a researcher working on early sound recordings, it is essential to have access to accurate metadata on the recordings examined. In its absence, not only it is not possible to refer precisely to the sound recording under investigation, but it is not even possible to identify the sound recording that is being used. The basic reference works for metadata of sound recordings are discographies, of which a significant number has been produced since 1936. And I use the term discography to refer to lists compiled retrospectively and with a view to completeness along predefined criteria. I will not deal with commercial record catalogs. Although they are important sources for discographic research, as publications they cannot be considered as lists compiled for scientific purposes. In my presentation, I will discuss two of the current challenges of the methodology of discography: the reliability of discographies and the issues of a global discography related to early recordings. In the almost 100 years since the publication of the first discography, Charles Delaunay's Hot Discography, many discographies have been created both in printed and electronic form, however, with different professional standards. Although the scientific methodology of discography has become more and more detailed over the decades, it is still not always applied. How do we know that the data in a discography are reliable? What are the criteria for the reliability of discographies? In the 1970s, several publications on the bibliographic control of discographies appeared, and in fact they were already dealing with these questions. However, the issue became a crucial one in the mid-1990s. In 1996, Tim Brooks published an open letter to the discographer community in the ARSC journal, the Journal of the Association for Recorded Sound Collections, pointing out that while computers are making it possible to handle ever larger amounts of data, the sources of this data are often unknown and their authenticity is sometimes questionable. He made three proposals. 1. The source of all entries should be noted. 2. In the case of a correction, it is not enough to provide the corrected information, but also to inform the reader about problematic cases. And 3. The sources should be annotated, just like in any other scholarly article. As he explained in a review in 2010, the compilation of previous discographies was based on the principle of the first to do it. So there was no need or demand for the references. And it is worth mentioning the scientific citation standards in the 1930s were different from today's. Today's discographers naturally use the content of earlier discographies, which is not problematic, unless one fails to cite the sources of data taken from them. Furthermore, as Brooks' second suggestion shows, the practice of source criticism, which should be the basis of all academic work, has not developed in the field of discography. Brooks was not the only one to advocate for sourcing of discographies during the second half century of the discipline. To cite a few earlier examples, George Blacker's 1974 data sheet included a field named Source of Information, and commenting on this data sheet, Horace Spear suggested distinguishing between data from the publication itself and secondary literature. Steve Smolian stated in 1976 that, I quote, "The discographer should examine every piece of material he cites, or, if this proves impossible, indicate from which secondary sources his information comes." And it is very funny, the continuation. it doesn't hurt to listen to the records either. Similarly, Jerome Weber argued that the recording date can be ascertained or inferred from many sources, but the difference between certain and inferred dates must be clearly stated. In his 1994 article, Guy Anthony Marco tried to educate discographers how to publish in a way that would be taken seriously by the academic world, and he even gave advice to publishers and editors of discographies. He listed the ways in which discographies could be brought into line with musicological publications, from the clarity of titles to uniform formal requirements and the proper use of the referencing apparatus. And Björn Englund also pointed out the lack of referencing and typographical peculiarities that are customary in academic publications, saying, "Unfortunately, discography has always been the work of dedicated amateurs who made up their own rules and abbreviations." It was a quotation from him. The debate over sourcing in discography flared up again around 2010 due to a 5-volume dance band discography. Since Brian Rust had earlier published a 2-volume discography on the same subject, it would have been particularly important to mark the sources. Which data was new and which data had been corrected, and whether the change was made for a reason or only because of a typo. The book was heavily criticized by Tim Brooks, and his review was followed by a series of opinion pieces. Not everyone agreed then, or no, with Brooks' views, either on the specific publication or on the method of sourcing in general. While the rules proposed by Brooks and others seem simple, they actually propagate a paradigm shift in discography. Discographers do not necessarily publish the results of their research in scientific journals, and consequently, the established scientific criteria cannot be fully applied to these texts. The quality of a discography is not necessarily inferior if it is published in a non-refereed journal or if there is no blind peer review process involving multiple participants during the evaluation of the article. Nevertheless, from a scientific point of view, there are obvious questions about the reliability of many discographies and the way in which the data are published. The scientifically minded reader may ask the question when looking at datasets in a discography without any sourcing and references, how do you know that? Experienced discographers obviously know which publishers, journals, and authors are reliable, and in the worst case, which are not. The publisher or the institution behind the discography can guarantee the quality of the publication. It can be assumed that the major professional journals, which usually publish their own discography templates and criteria, or the publishers specializing in discography, Greenwood Press, Scarecrow Press, Mainspring Press, or Birgit Lotz Verlag, and so on, publish reliable lists. Furthermore, looking at some of the Greenwood Press publications, it may be noticed that there are many ways of indicating sources accurately but sparingly. There may be footnotes or endnotes with an asterisk in the main text to indicate which item has an endnote. In the case of a discography based largely on one type of source, the original records, the author can indicate those items where this was not the case, using the letter code of the record catalog which served as the source. Tim Brooks recommends that in the case of printed publications, the author should explain the sources of the discography in a detailed introductory essay, including their physical and content descriptions and locations, and then inform the reader in a footnote in special cases. The main arguments against Brooks' propositions are the overloading of discography datasets and considerations of space, that is, the cost of printing. Indeed, footnoting each piece of data in a discography of several hundred pages significantly overloads its data series and can even double the size of a printed volume. An obvious solution would be to publish in electronic form. As early as in 1994, Rainer Lotz considered that a national discography of the size of the Deutsche Nationaldiskografie would be more practical and, above all, more economical if published electronically, but he concluded that many of the users who were the target audience of the discography did not have the necessary tools to manage an electronic database in 1994. In this respect, the 21st century is less problematic. For example, Alan Kelly published the complete catalog and discography of the Gramophone Company on CD-ROM in 2003. And there are several examples from the first decades of the 21st century in which a discography was published on CD-ROM as an appendix to a reference book. And the possibilities of publishing on the internet have opened up a wide new field for discographers. It also happens that a national discography available online serves an appendix to a printed volume on the history of sound recordings of a given country. And the discography can be accessed via a link in a book or by scanning a QR code. Moreover, electronic publication in a database with good search functions not only reduces the size of the volume in relation to the sourcing, but also makes the indexes, which are indispensable in a printed volume and are based on the specificities of the given genre, superfluous. Surely everyone here has used online discographic databases such as Charm or DAHR, all of which have a field where the sources of the data can be indicated. Although whether the source is the same for all data in the discography is a question. In Charm's discographic database, a single source is listed in the catalog field, while DAHR lists the sources in the notes field with some differentiation possible. And since, hopefully, the users all know which institutions are behind these databases, they do not question their reliability. Unfortunately, even in the early 21st century, it is still rare for a discographic database to be linked to an institution, thus ensuring that the database is edited by experts. Of course, there are also databases compiled by a single author. For example, Michael Gray's discography focusing on classical music recordings from the LP era, or Christian Zwarg's 78 RPM label discographies, where the author's well-known expertise and decades of research ensure the reliability of the discography. But even this reputation only counts among discographers. A musicologist doesn't necessarily know the names of the best discographers of our time. And, unfortunately, we must add that neither electronic databases nor online publication have solved the issue of reliability. Community-based second-generation web offers new opportunities for creating and publishing discographies. Online discographic databases sometimes allow users to enter bulk data, which is the basis of the otherwise commercial Discogs and ClassSite databases. However, precisely for this reason, a distinction needs to be made between databases based on expert editing and those based on community uploading. There is no doubt that the Discogs.com database is a highly valuable resource, especially for releases where the full documentation and photos of the medium are visible. But it is important to be aware that it is uploaded by users, and these data don't undergo content editing, and their quality control is only measured by the votes of the Discogs user community. Nevertheless, it seems logical to conclude that a universal discographic database could be compiled from all the, hopefully, reliable national print and online discographies, containing data on every sound recording ever released, regardless of genre, availability, or any other aspect. It was not for the first time that the YASA and ARSC discography committees raised the idea of a joint universal discography database at the 2018 ARSC conference in Baltimore. In the past few years, the YASA and ARSC universal discography database has aimed to create an umbrella database of discographic data about existing and lost sound recordings, phonograph cylinders, and gramophone records made between 1885 and 1960, based on data harvesting from existing discographies. This database is currently under preparation. However, it seems that several factors hinder the creation of a universal discographic database. These obstacles include financial, technological, and methodological ones. In addition to the high cost of creating and maintaining such a database, the management of the huge amount of data requires an IT background, as well as hardware and software that are only available to institutions, such as national or university libraries. While it is possible to create software that can import data from different sources and organize it to a new database, for this to work effectively, the source databases would need to have a consistent structure. However, existing discographic databases are mostly created according to different methodologies and with different structures. The online catalogs of national libraries are usually not suitable for the extraction of discographic data. For example, the online catalog of the Hungarian National Library, the National Széchenyi Library, describes a 78 RPM disk in one entry. Consequently, it makes impossible to allocate the matrix numbers to the titles and issue numbers. If these catalogs already available online cannot be used to create a new database, it would be necessary to re-catalog huge institutional collections. An AI-based software that can be trained to recognize and appropriately reorder discographic data types could be a solution to these problems. But, as I discussed this with Klaus-Peter Gallenmiller last year here in Guildford, this is not yet a capability of AI. And even if all these problems can be solved, the question of standardization of spellings will still arise, as different transliterations occur in the discographies and databases created in different countries and even within a single country. The task is further complicated by a lack of willingness to cooperate. Cooperation is sometimes difficult even between institutions, not to mention private collectors. And even if there is openness to cooperate, sometimes the incompatibility of different national laws can create insurmountable obstacles to the online publication of a sound recording, for example. Finally, it should be noted that not all countries have a national discography. Not only is the DAHR not yet complete with its almost 500,000 records, but the discographies of the most important European countries in the history of sound recordings have not been compiled. Realizing this problem, 4 national libraries, led by the Gesellschaft für historische Tonträger and several other European music-related associations, submitted an application to the EU's Creative Europe program in 2021 for a discographical project similar to the AHR, but focusing on European sound recordings, safeguarding European historical recordings. However, the application was not successful. The rich sound heritage of the Near and Far East, for which the current academic word languages are inadequate, could also be included here. The unavailability of sound recordings and their data in certain countries can have serious implications for interpretation analysis. To give just one example, there is a rich literature on early Puccini interpretation, with a dedicated article on the recordings of soprano singers who collaborated with the composer, and an analysis of Puccini recordings of tenor singers of the Puccini era. Puccini visited Hungary on several occasions and personally staged 2 of his operas, Madama Butterfly and La Fanciulla del West, with the performers of the Royal Hungarian Opera. He appreciated Elsa Somosi, the soprano of the title roles in both operas, in such an extent that he recommended her to an American impresario, and she became the first singer in North America to sing the title role in Madama Butterfly. Although many Hungarian singers of the time, including Elsa Somosi, made recordings of Puccini arias, their recordings are missing from the international literature of Puccini performance. The reasons for this are obvious. These recordings were not known to scholars. Even in Roger Fleury's monumental Puccini discography, only fragmentary details of some of them are included, and the Hungarian national discography still doesn't exist. These recordings are in Hungarian, So their international distribution has been minimal, and they were not available on modern media until the 2020s. Of course, this is not only true for Hungary. In the second half of the 20th century, the Iron Curtain prevented the discographical data of the countries of the Eastern Bloc from reaching the horizon of international research. The acknowledgements of Barnes and Girard's excellent vertical cut Discography, published in 1964, omit almost the entire Eastern Bloc, obviously for historical reasons. The only exception is a Czech lady from Paris. Global discography is therefore very much needed, not only to give researchers of early sound recordings access to the sources of their research, but also to enable them to get to know the sources at all. Without a reliable discography, we don't even know which recordings we still need to find to do our research properly. Discographers, including those who started their research in the era of printed discographies, agree that the most important task for the next decades is to create an online, peer-reviewed, universal discographic database. An editorial board would not only guarantee the necessary high level of methodological background and data reliability, but would also oversee the application of predefined rules for standardization. According to Rainer Lotz, a peer-reviewed but open-edited online discographic database, as he says it, wiki of discographies, would allow for detailed sourcing, real-time updates, and corrections. Thank you very much.